He sheltered two freezing alien sisters. 2 years later, 5,000 ships circled cabin. Ben had always preferred solitude. Nestled on the edge of a harsh, frozen planet, his cabin stood as a beacon of isolation, far removed from the bustling life of galactic cities or the endless wars that had ravaged the universe. His days were spent in quiet reflection, the chill air of the alien world serving as the perfect backdrop for the peace he craved. A soldier once, now a recluse, Ben had walked away from the chaos of intergalactic conflict years ago, leaving behind a past full of bloodshed and betrayal. Here, on this remote world, he could start over. No questions, no demands. But the storm that tore through the planet that fateful night shattered that calm existence. Ben had been securing supplies in his cabin when the roar of wind and the rumble of thunder alerted him to something else, something far more dangerous than a mere storm. The sky crackled with unnatural energy, as if something larger than a weather disturbance was at play. He grabbed his blaster, an old relic from his days in the military, and moved cautiously to the door, sensing something out of place. The snow outside whipped through the air in furious torrents, the wind howling like the ghosts of a forgotten world. But even through the chaos, Ben spotted something that made his heart skip a beat. A small ship, half buried in the snow, its engines sputtering and sparking as if it had been forced down. He immediately recognized the markings on the hull. It was an alien craft, unmistakable in its design. But what struck him even more was the faint, frantic signal he was picking up. A distress call. Without thinking, Ben grabbed his thermal suit, raced to the door, and battled his way through the raging storm. As he approached the wreckage, he saw two figures stumbling toward him through the snow. His heart lurched at the sight of them, two alien women, their bodies battered and bruised, struggling against the elements. One of them was dragging the other, a much younger female who appeared to be unconscious. The older woman, a dark-skinned alien with glowing eyes and a sleek alien design to her face, looked up as Ben approached. She looked exhausted, desperate, and cold, her movements slow and deliberate as if each step took immense effort. The other woman, a younger version of her with pale skin and shorter hair, was almost lifeless in her arms, her breathing ragged and shallow. Ben didn't think twice. His military training kicked in, and without hesitation, he slung the younger woman over his shoulder and helped the older one back toward the cabin. There was no time to waste. The storm would only grow worse. Inside, Ben immediately set to work. He moved the women to the hearth and quickly started a fire, knowing that warmth was the first priority. The older one, still trembling from the cold, watched him with wary eyes but said nothing. Ben didn't ask questions, not yet. His priority was survival. He wrapped both women in blankets and set up a crude medical station to check for injuries. After a few moments, the older woman broke the silence, her voice deep but laced with exhaustion. "Thank you," she said, her accent thick and unfamiliar. You are human." Ben nodded, still moving efficiently around the cabin, making sure the fire was burning properly. "I am. Who are you?" The woman hesitated, as if considering whether to answer. She glanced down at her younger sister, who was still unconscious. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low but firm. "I am Kayla. This is my sister, Lyra. We need your help." Ben paused, looking up at her. There was a certain urgency in her tone, a gravity that told him this was no ordinary rescue. His instincts, honed by years of military service, told him he had just become part of something much bigger than himself. "Where are you from?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. Kayla's eyes narrowed. "We are from a distant world, one that is under attack. Our ship was damaged during our escape. We crashed here thinking we were safe, but the people who pursue us are relentless. They will find us no matter where we go." Ben didn't respond immediately, still trying to process what she had just said. The galaxy was filled with warring factions, and refugees were nothing new. But something about Kayla's words struck a chord in him. He had seen conflict firsthand, and he knew that the stakes could be far higher than just a few survivors fleeing a war. He glanced at Lyra, whose pale face seemed almost lifeless against the warm glow of the fire. Her breathing was more steady now, but she was still unconscious, her body too weak to fight the cold. Ben realized she might not last the night without medical help. Without saying a word, Ben moved to his medical supplies and began examining Lyra's injuries. As he worked, he could feel Kayla's eyes on him, observing his every move. There was a moment of silence, then Kayla spoke again. "We didn't choose this life," she said quietly. We were once part of a peaceful people, but war came to our world and we were forced to flee. The enemy that chases us, they won't stop until we are dead." Ben paused, looking at her. Her expression was hard, and her eyes held a depth of sorrow and fear that he couldn't ignore. The weight of her words lingered in the room. "Who are they?" Ben asked, his voice calm but insistent. Kayla's eyes flashed briefly, a mixture of anger and fear. "They are a powerful empire, one that has conquered many worlds. They seek control over the galaxy, and my sister and I, we are symbols. Our survival is a threat to them. They will stop at nothing to see us destroyed." Ben took a deep breath. The thought of becoming involved in an intergalactic conflict, especially one so personal, wasn't something he had ever planned for. He had walked away from all of that for a reason. But now, with these two women in his cabin, one of them on the brink of death, it was no longer a matter of avoiding conflict. It was a matter of doing what he knew was right. "I'll help you," Ben said simply, his voice steady. "But we need to get you both in better shape. We can't fight if you're not strong enough to stand." Kayla nodded, a mixture of gratitude and resolve in her gaze. "We know, but we cannot stay here long. The storm is nothing compared to what's coming. If we stay too long, they will find us." Ben could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a sense of determination. These women had been through something unimaginable, and yet they still had the strength to fight. It made Ben wonder what kind of enemies they were facing. Whoever these people were, they weren't just ruthless, they were something far worse. "I won't let them get you," Ben said, his voice firm. It wasn't just a promise, it was a decision. He had no idea how he would keep it, but he would. He couldn't just turn his back on them. "Not now." Kayla studied him for a moment, then finally spoke. "We don't expect you to fight for us, but if you help us, we can escape. We have allies. We can make them pay." The room fell into a heavy silence as Ben digested her words. She was talking about revenge, and that was something he could understand. But Ben knew better than to get involved in a fight without understanding the full picture. These were not just refugees. They were part of something bigger, something dangerous. "We'll talk more tomorrow," Ben said, breaking the silence. "You need rest, and so does your sister." Kayla nodded, and Ben moved back to the fire, making sure the warmth stayed strong. As the night dragged on, Kayla settled down on the floor beside her sister, her watchful eyes never leaving the fire, as if expecting it to betray them at any moment. Ben didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the fire, lost in thought. The storm outside howled, but inside the cabin it was warm and quiet, almost too quiet. There was no escaping the reality of the situation. He had just taken in two alien fugitives, and their enemies were not far behind. Ben's peaceful life was slipping through his fingers, and a new chapter had begun, one he wasn't sure he was prepared for. But Ben knew one thing for certain. The days of living in isolation were over. And now his past, full of soldiers and battles, had come back to find him. The days that followed the storm were tense. The cabin, once a symbol of Ben's solitary peace, had become the epicenter of a quiet, unspoken war. Ben kept his promise to the sisters, tending to their needs, ensuring they stayed warm and rested, but the reality of their situation loomed over every conversation. They couldn't stay here forever. Every day spent in the cabin was another day the enemy could be closing in on them. Kayla, despite her injuries, had a quiet determination in her eyes. Her tough exterior hid the fear that still clung to her. Ben had witnessed that same fear in soldiers before, but this was different. She wasn't running from just a war. She was running from the very heart of an empire that would stop at nothing to see her and her sister eradicated. Ben had a lot of questions. He wanted to know more about these enemies who were hunting the sisters, but he held off, respecting the delicate nature of their situation. The sisters had shared only snippets of their story, and Ben could see how much it weighed on them. He didn't push them. The more he learned, the more he understood that they weren't simply fleeing from a war. They were fleeing from a war that had already consumed their homeworld. One evening, when Lyra had finally woken up, Ben found himself sitting across from the sisters, staring into the fire. He could sense the tension in the room, the heavy silence that hung between them. Lyra, still pale but much improved, had been quiet since her recovery, her large, expressive eyes filled with confusion and lingering fear. She wasn't as tough as Kayla, but she carried the same fear and determination. "How long until they come for us?" Ben asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the urgency was clear. The Empire, whoever they were, wouldn't stop until they found the sisters. Kayla's eyes flickered with a mix of sorrow and resolve. They're already looking for us. They have agents everywhere. Our survival is a threat to them. The longer we're alive, the more dangerous it becomes for both us and for anyone who helps us. Ben leaned back, his fingers gripping the worn edge of his chair. He wasn't a strategist or a general, but he could sense the gravity of their situation. The stakes were too high. Whatever they were running from, it was something far bigger than just two women seeking refuge. "How big is this empire you're talking about?" he asked quietly, hoping for a more detailed explanation. Kayla hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if weighing whether or not to reveal more. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with anger. "It's called the Akra Dominion, a vast empire that controls most of the known galaxy. They conquer worlds and erase entire civilizations just to expand their reach. They are ruthless, and their leader, Emperor Zorath, will stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. He'll send entire fleets after a single individual if it means keeping his rule intact." Ben's eyes widened. The thought of an empire that powerful, one with fleets of ships and the ability to erase entire worlds, was enough to make anyone nervous. But what struck him even harder was the coldness in her words. Kayla spoke of this empire with a level of hatred that made Ben wonder what she had seen. "And you too?" Ben's voice trailed off as he looked at Lyra, who had been silent throughout most of the conversation. "What makes you so important to them?" Lyra, her eyes still heavy with exhaustion, spoke for the first time since waking up. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "We're not just anyone. We are the daughters of one of the most powerful men in the Akra Dominion, the Emperor's right-hand general. Our survival is a symbol of rebellion, a symbol of resistance. If we're alive, it means the Empire is vulnerable." Ben stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. These two women weren't just fleeing from an enemy. They were fugitives from the highest level of the Akra Dominion, the very heart of the Empire. They weren't just survivors. They were targets, and their survival was a threat that could bring the Empire to its knees. "But why would your father, this general, let you run?" Ben asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. "If these two women were so important, why hadn't they been protected better?" Kayla's face hardened, and for the first time, Ben saw a flash of deep emotion cross her features, pain. "My father, he never wanted us to be involved in the war. He tried to protect us, but he knew that the moment we were born, we would be used as pawns. That's what they do in the Akra Dominion. They use their own blood as weapons." Lyra lowered her head, her eyes flicking to the fire. Ben could sense the depth of the loss she had experienced and the weight of the betrayal she must have felt. It wasn't just the enemy that had betrayed them. It was their own bloodline, their own father, who had been powerless to stop the Empire's machinations. Kayla's voice dropped lower, filled with a new kind of quiet fury. "We couldn't stay. Not while the Empire was at war with everything we stood for. They wanted to use us to solidify their power. But we weren't just going to sit back and let them. We fought, and that's why we're here now." Ben didn't know how to respond. He had always been a man of action, someone who knew how to fight. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about resisting a force that had the power to wipe out entire civilizations with a snap of its fingers. The empire these sisters were running from wasn't something he could fight alone. Yet somehow, Ben had already made his choice. He had offered them his shelter, and now he couldn't simply turn them away. His life had become intertwined with theirs, and the consequences of that were now unavoidable. As the days passed, Ben helped the sisters recover. He taught them how to survive on the icy planet, showing them how to trap animals for food and how to make the most of the sparse resources he had. Kayla, despite her tough exterior, proved to be a quick learner. She picked up the skills Ben showed her with ease, adapting quickly to the harsh conditions. Lyra, though weaker, started to regain some of her strength, but her quiet nature never fully disappeared. Ben often found her staring out of the cabin's small window, lost in thought, as if she were seeing something far beyond the frozen wasteland outside. Ben's own life, once so simple, had become more complicated with each passing day. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, worried about what might be lurking out there in the wilderness. Every noise, every crack in the snow had him on edge, expecting an attack. But as the days turned into weeks, nothing came. At least nothing that they could see. It was Kayla who finally broke the silence one evening after a long day of repairs and hunting. They were sitting around the fire, the warm glow flickering on their faces when she spoke. "We need to leave," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We've stayed here too long. The enemy will find us if we don't move soon." Ben frowned, looking at her. "Where will we go? We can't outrun them. They'll track us no matter where we go." Kayla nodded, her gaze steady. "We don't have to outrun them. We just need to survive long enough to get the message out. We have allies, people who will help us, but we have to make contact first." Ben sat back, his mind racing. The situation was becoming more complicated by the minute. He had never planned on being involved in a galactic conflict, but now it seemed like there was no way out. If he helped the sisters, he would be marked as a target, too. And the enemy they were facing wasn't something he could simply shoot his way out of. But there was something about Kayla's resolve, something about Lyra's quiet strength, that made him believe they were worth fighting for. They weren't just two alien fugitives. They were symbols of resistance, fighting for something bigger than themselves. And maybe, just maybe, he could help them win. The decision to leave was not one Ben made lightly. The idea of leaving the safety of his cabin, the one place he had managed to find peace in after years of conflict, unsettled him. But as the days stretched into weeks, the quiet isolation that had once felt like a refuge now seemed like a trap. Ben had known this moment would come, but it still felt like a gut punch when it did. Kayla's urgency was clear. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that their enemies would discover them. The Crad Dominion's agents had eyes everywhere, and the signal Ben had picked up a few nights ago was a sign that the Empire was already tracking their movements. They couldn't afford to stay any longer, not if they wanted to stay ahead of the threat. For the first time since the sisters' arrival, Ben felt the weight of their situation press down on him. The rebellion they spoke of, the allies waiting for them, wasn't a guarantee. It was a hope, a slim chance that they could escape the Empire's iron grip, but hope was better than nothing. Ben knew that the only way to truly protect the sisters was to move them, to get them somewhere safe where they could regroup. So with heavy hearts, they packed up the cabin and prepared to leave. The wind howled outside, the cold of the alien planet's winter pressing against the walls of the cabin. Ben moved quickly, checking his supplies and making sure everything was ready. Kayla, her demeanor calm and focused, worked alongside him. Lyra, still recovering, was quieter than usual, her eyes scanning the storm outside with a distant expression. She didn't speak much, but Ben could feel the fear in the air, thick and palpable, like a shadow that followed them wherever they went. The storm had been raging for days, its winds like whips against the landscape. The planet's weather was unpredictable, and the temperature could drop to dangerous levels in a matter of hours. Ben knew they had to leave before the storm worsened. Their best chance was to move while they still had a window of time. As they made their way out of the cabin, Ben couldn't help but glance back at the small, familiar building. It had been his sanctuary, his place of peace. Now it was just another chapter in his past, one he had to leave behind. The trek through the storm was grueling. The wind cut through their clothes like knives, and the snowstorm made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Kayla led the way, her experience in navigating difficult terrain evident in the way she moved through the storm with confidence. Ben followed closely behind, making sure Lyra was able to keep up. Her steps were slow, her energy still low, but she was determined to stay strong. They had a destination in mind, a small cave system a few miles away. It wasn't the safest place, but it was hidden enough that they might be able to avoid detection. Ben knew that once they were inside, they could regroup, rest, and figure out their next move. But he also knew that time was running out. The storm was their best cover, but it wouldn't last forever. As they trudged through the deep snow, the wind biting at their faces, Ben kept his eyes on the horizon, his senses alert for any signs of danger. Every crack in the snow, every shift in the wind had him on edge. The thought of the Crad Dominion's fleet closing in on them haunted his every step. They were getting closer, he could feel it. The cave, when they finally reached it, offered little comfort. It was cold, damp, and smelled of earth and decay, but it was shelter. They set up a small fire inside, and Ben immediately started to prepare food for the sisters. Kayla, ever the strategist, began organizing their gear, making sure everything was in order in case they had to move again quickly. Lyra, exhausted from the journey, settled near the fire, wrapping herself in a blanket. Her eyes were closed, but Ben could see that she wasn't sleeping. Her mind was racing, and he could only imagine the thoughts running through her head. They were both running from a galaxy-wide empire with no real plan beyond finding allies. The weight of their situation was starting to sink in, and Ben could feel it in the air, the sense of urgency that clung to them all. As they ate in silence, Kayla broke the tension. Her voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it. "We can't stay here long," she said, looking at Ben. "We'll need to move again soon. The Crad Dominion will be searching the area, and they'll send patrols through these caves eventually." Ben nodded. "I know. But we need to rest. You both need to recover. You can't keep pushing yourselves like this." Kayla didn't argue. She understood the situation better than anyone, but Ben could see that she was fighting her own fears. She was the protector, the one who had led them here, but even she couldn't deny the growing sense of danger. They were caught in a game with no rules, and the stakes were higher than ever. Ben had learned over the years how to face danger. He had learned how to survive in the most unforgiving conditions. But this was different. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was trying to protect two women who had become more than just strangers. They were his responsibility now. He couldn't turn his back on them, not after everything they had been through. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a small comfort in the cold, damp cave. Ben sat with his back against the wall, staring into the flames. His thoughts were clouded, his mind racing through possible scenarios. What if the Crad Dominion found them? What if they were forced into a fight they couldn't win? Kayla broke the silence again, her voice low but filled with conviction. "We have a plan. There are others out there, people who'll help us, but we need to contact them before it's too late." Ben looked at her, surprised. "You have allies? You've been in contact with them?" Kayla nodded, her eyes fierce. "Not directly, but we have ways of sending messages. They'll know we're here, we just have to hold out long enough." Ben didn't question her further. He could see the determination in her eyes, the unshakable belief that they could make it out of this alive. It wasn't just about escaping the Crad Dominion anymore. It was about fighting back, about taking a stand against a force that had tried to crush them. As the hours passed, the storm outside raged on, but inside the cave they were safe, for now. Ben kept the fire burning, his eyes occasionally flicking to the entrance of the cave, making sure no one was following them. The storm was both a blessing and a curse. It kept them hidden, but it also meant that the longer they stayed, the more likely it was that their enemies would find them. By the time the storm began to die down, Ben had already made up his mind. They couldn't stay here forever. They had to move, find a way to contact the allies Kayla spoke of, and they had to do it quickly. The fire had burned low and the cold of the cave was creeping in. Ben stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. Kayla was already packing up their things, preparing for the journey ahead. Lyra had fallen into a fitful sleep, her body still weak but her mind restless. Ben walked over to her, kneeling beside her. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice soft. Lyra's eyes opened slowly, her gaze heavy but grateful. "I'm fine, just tired." She paused, then added quietly, "I'm sorry for all of this." Ben shook his head, offering a reassuring smile. "You don't need to apologize, you're not the one who's caused any of this. You've been through more than anyone should." Lyra nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Ben couldn't shake. He knew she blamed herself, at least in part, for what had happened. But Ben didn't blame her. The Crad Dominion was to blame. They were the ones who had turned a peaceful people into refugees, hunted them down like animals. He would fight, if necessary, to protect her and Kayla. He owed them that much. The time had come. They had to move again. Ben looked up at Kayla, who had finished packing their gear. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady. Kayla nodded, her expression grim but determined. "Let's go." With that, they stepped out into the storm once more. The wind howled, the cold biting into their skin, but they moved forward, knowing that their survival depended on what came next. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges, but for the first time in weeks, Ben felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was fighting for something. He was fighting for them, and that was enough. The cold outside was relentless, the wind biting through the fabric of their clothes as they trudged through the snow. The cave they had briefly called shelter was now behind them, nothing more than a memory of a fleeting safety. Kayla led the way, her steps sure despite the harsh conditions. She had been through worse, Ben could tell. Her resolve was unshakable, and her determination to protect her sister was all-consuming. Ben followed closely, with Lyra between them, her strength growing with each passing day. though she still lacked the stamina she had before the crash. She moved slowly, her gaze often lost in the distance, and every now and then Ben would catch her glancing back at the cave, as if hoping the danger hadn't followed them. For Ben, each step was a reminder of the stakes. The planet's cold, desolate landscape seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them, but it was the silence that was the hardest to bear. No bird calls, no rustling of leaves, just the howling wind and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. It was like walking in a world forgotten by time. Kayla had promised Ben they were headed to a place where they could make contact with their allies, but the more Ben thought about it, the more questions surfaced. Who were these allies? How could they possibly stand against an empire as vast and powerful as the Crad Dominion? It felt like a desperate hope, something to hold onto when everything else seemed impossible. They had to keep moving, though. There was no turning back now. Kayla kept her focus ahead, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The worry that had once been a silent companion in her gaze had now turned to something more intense, something more like a warning. Every time Ben glanced at her, he saw it, a flicker of concern that wasn't about the immediate environment, but something more. It was a look that spoke of the constant fear that haunted her. Finally, after hours of walking, they reached their destination, a cluster of rocky outcrops, jagged and unforgiving, standing against the storm like ancient sentinels. Ben had no idea where they were, but Kayla's confident movements told him this was the place. She crouched low behind one of the rocks, signaling for Ben and Lyra to join her. They huddled together, sheltered from the wind for the first time in hours. Ben couldn't help but look around, half expecting to see something lurking in the distance. But the landscape remained empty, stretching endlessly into the gray sky. The silence pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. "This is where we make contact," Kayla said, her voice low but firm. She was already working with a small device she had retrieved from her pack, a communicator of sorts. Ben had never seen anything like it, a small, sleek object that seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't quite place. "Will it work?" Ben asked, his voice filled with skepticism. It seemed like a long shot. How could a simple communicator possibly reach the allies Kayla had mentioned? What if they were too far away, or worse, what if the Crad Dominion had already discovered them? "It has to," Kayla replied, her eyes meeting his. "It's our only hope." Lyra, who had been quiet for most of the journey, finally spoke up, her voice soft but heavy. "Do you think they'll come for us? Do you think they'll really help?" Kayla's expression softened, and for the first time Ben saw a glimpse of vulnerability in her. "They will," she said, her voice unwavering. "They're waiting for us, they know we're here." But Ben wasn't so sure. He wanted to believe her. He really did. The thought of being rescued, of finally escaping the Empire's grasp, was tempting. But Ben knew better than to rely on hope alone. Hope wasn't going to stop the Empire from coming for them. It wasn't going to protect the sisters from the endless pursuit that had been their reality for so long. As Kayla continued to work on the communicator, Ben scanned the area again, his instincts still sharp despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. The storm seemed to be easing, but the stillness felt wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that they weren't as alone as they appeared. And then it happened. The device in Kayla's hands beeped, its screen flashing with a series of symbols that Ben couldn't understand. Kayla's face lit up with a mixture of relief and tension, but before she could speak, a voice crackled through the device. "Kayla, Lyra." The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Ben could hear the hope in Kayla's eyes before she even spoke. "We're here," Kayla responded, her voice steady. "We've made it. We need extraction now. The Crad Dominion is closing in. We don't have much time." There was a pause on the other end, and then a voice replied, more urgent now. "We're tracking your signal. Hold tight. We'll be there within the hour. Do not engage the enemy. Stay hidden." Kayla's expression tightened as she cut off the communicator. She looked at Ben, her eyes hard and resolute. "They're coming, but we can't wait here too long. We need to move again." Ben felt a surge of relief, followed quickly by the weight of the situation. They had a chance now, an actual chance. But it came with its own set of risks. The Crad Dominion would be closing in on them. They couldn't risk being caught in the open. "Where do we go?" Ben asked, his mind already working through the possible escape routes. "There's a safe house," Kayla replied, "but it's further out. We'll have to move quickly. It's our best shot." Ben nodded. There was no time to waste. He glanced at Lyra, who seemed more alert now, though still weary. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment Ben saw something in them, a spark of hope, tempered by the reality of their situation. They weren't out of danger yet. They never would be until the Crad Dominion was gone. The three of them set off again, moving quickly but carefully through the rocky outcrops, their steps light but purposeful. The storm had finally begun to die down, but the air was still frigid, the cold creeping into their bones despite their best efforts to keep warm. Ben kept his focus on the horizon, scanning for any signs of danger, but the land ahead was eerily still. As they moved, Ben's thoughts turned inward. He had become more than just a protector. In some ways, he had become a part of this cause, this fight. At first, it had felt like a responsibility, an obligation to help the sisters. But now, it was personal. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't let the Crad Dominion win. He had seen enough of their brutality, their unrelenting desire to crush anything that opposed them. And now, they were coming for people Ben had grown to care for. That was something he couldn't ignore. His thoughts were interrupted when Kayla suddenly stopped, her hand raised in a signal for them to halt. She crouched low, her sharp eyes scanning the area ahead. Ben tensed, his heart rate quickening. "What is it?" he whispered. "Movement," Kayla said, her voice low but filled with certainty. "We're not alone." Ben's hand went to the blaster at his side. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Lyra looked at him, her expression calm but alert, ready for whatever was coming. A few moments later, the sound of footsteps reached them, slow at first, then picking up speed. Ben's pulse quickened. He knew they couldn't afford to be discovered. The sound grew louder, and just as Ben was about to suggest they move again, the figures appeared. There were two of them, humanoid but with a distinctly alien appearance, their features obscured by the snowstorm's fading veil. They wore dark armor, their movements purposeful but cautious. Ben's hand tightened around his blaster. These weren't just any travelers. These were soldiers, and Ben knew exactly who they worked for, a Crad Dominion. Kayla's voice was a barely audible whisper. "Stay down, don't move." The soldiers came closer, their boots crunching in the snow as they surveyed the area. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as he tried to steady his nerves. He glanced at Kayla, who was tense, every muscle coiled, ready for anything. But they were outnumbered, and they were running out of time. Ben's grip on his blaster tightened. If the soldiers discovered them, everything was over. Suddenly, one of the soldiers turned, his head snapping to the side. Ben's heart stopped. But then, just as quickly, the soldier continued forward, his focus on something in the distance. They were scanning the landscape, searching for anything that might be out of place. Ben exhaled, his breath a silent release of relief. The soldiers had missed them by mere inches. Kayla motioned for them to move, and the three of them quickly and quietly retreated further into the rocky outcrops, their footsteps muffled by the snow. Ben's mind raced as they hurried through the terrain. The soldiers hadn't found them, but they wouldn't be far behind. There was no time to waste. The cold wind bit into Ben's skin as he led the sisters through the rocky outcrops, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain for any sign of danger. His heart pounded in his chest, and the sharp, freezing air made each breath feel like it might be his last. The soldiers had come so close, too close. They had nearly been discovered, and the thought of the Crad Dominion closing in on them, step by step, was a terrifying reality Ben couldn't ignore. Kayla moved ahead, her steps silent despite the treacherous landscape. She was focused, her gaze unwavering, but Ben could see the tension in her posture, the fear buried deep inside her. She didn't show it often, but he knew it was there. She had seen too much, and she carried the weight of it all. Lyra was behind him, her pace slower but steady, and Ben found himself checking on her more than once. She was still recovering, still fragile, and he knew she couldn't handle another close call like that. They couldn't stay in the open for long. Ben knew that. The soldiers from the Crad Dominion were still out there, searching. The longer they stayed exposed, the more likely it was they would be found. Kayla had promised that help was coming, but Ben wasn't the kind of man to wait passively for salvation. He had lived through too much to just rely on hope. He needed to make sure they survived. As they moved deeper into the rocky terrain, Kayla suddenly stopped, her hand raised in a signal to halt. Ben crouched beside her, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the situation. She was looking at something in the distance, something he couldn't see yet. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice low. "Movement," Kayla replied, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "Two, maybe three figures. They're moving fast, too fast." Ben's instincts flared. He didn't need to ask who it was. The Crad Dominion's soldiers were relentless, and they had a way of turning up when least expected. He shifted his weight, crouching lower to the ground, his hand instinctively moving toward his blaster. He didn't want to use it. He didn't want to be forced into a fight. But he knew that if they were discovered now, their chances of escape would dwindle to nothing. Kayla's eyes flicked to the left, her sharp gaze scanning the horizon. "They'll be here soon. We need to find cover." Ben nodded, signaling for Lyra to stay low as he motioned for Kayla to lead the way. They moved quickly but cautiously, slipping between the rocky outcrops, keeping their movements silent. The wind howled around them, masking the sound of their steps, but Ben's ears remained sharp, every muscle in his body tensed for the moment the soldiers would appear. They reached a narrow crevice in the rocks, just big enough to squeeze through. Kayla slipped through first, then Ben, and finally Lyra. The crevice was dark, and Ben could feel the weight of the rock pressing against him as they huddled inside. There was barely enough room for all three of them, but it was the best hiding spot they had. The wind outside howled even louder now, and the crackling of the snowstorm made it hard to hear anything else. Kayla pressed herself against the rock, her eyes focused on the narrow gap between them and the outside world. She didn't speak, but her expression was hard, her mind racing. Ben watched her closely, his hand still resting on his blaster. He wasn't sure what they were waiting for, but he knew that they couldn't stay hidden forever. The soldiers would pass soon, or they would circle back. Either way, they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. For what felt like an eternity, they waited. The cold seeped into their bones, the silence stretching out between them. Lyra was still, her breath soft, her face pale in the dim light. Ben couldn't help but look at her, worry gnawing at him. She was young, still so young, and yet she had been forced to flee from everything she had ever known. To survive, she had become someone else, someone stronger, more resilient, but at what cost? Finally, just as Ben was about to speak, Kayla's fingers brushed against his arm, signaling for him to be quiet. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she watched the gap in the rocks. Ben held his breath, straining to hear. Footsteps. Slow at first, then quickening. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as the soldiers' boots crunched through the snow. He could hear them now, their movements getting closer. They were searching, no doubt looking for any sign of the fugitives they had been chasing. The cold seemed to wrap around Ben's chest, squeezing the air from his lungs as he waited for them to pass. The soldiers' voices reached Ben's ears, low, muffled, but clear enough to make out. "They've got to be around here somewhere," one of them said. His voice was deep, commanding. "They wouldn't have gone far." Ben held his breath, his pulse racing. The soldiers were so close. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of every second that passed. If they didn't move soon, they would be trapped, exposed, with no way out. "Do you think they went this way?" the second soldier asked. He sounded younger, less sure of himself. "They're smart. They know we'll track them. We'll have to sweep the entire area." "Don't miss a single rock." The soldiers moved closer, their voices fading as they passed by, but the threat was still there. Ben's fingers gripped his blaster tighter, his heart racing. The soldiers were moving on, but the danger wasn't over. They had just passed through their hiding spot. If they turned back, it would be over for them. Kayla motioned for them to stay put. Ben watched her closely, her expression intense. She was thinking, planning, calculating their next move. He trusted her, he had to, but the fear gnawed at him. What if they were wrong? What if the soldiers found them again? Time passed, seconds feeling like minutes. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Kayla gestured for them to move. Slowly, carefully, they slipped from the crevice, moving deeper into the rocks, away from the soldiers who had narrowly missed them. The next few hours were a blur of quick movements, desperate hiding, and long stretches of waiting. Ben's mind raced with thoughts of what came next. The soldiers were relentless, and they would keep searching until they found the sisters. Ben couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let the Crad Dominion win. After what felt like forever, they reached the edge of a small valley, the jagged rocks falling away into a wide, snow-covered plain. Kayla stopped, her sharp eyes scanning the area. The storm had calmed a little, but the wind still howled, pushing snow in every direction. "They'll be here soon," Kayla said quietly, her voice tense but calm. "We need to hold out." Ben glanced around. There was no place to hide here, no shelter. The valley was wide open, and if the Akras soldiers were tracking them, they wouldn't have much time. They had to make a move now. "We need to move," Ben said, his voice low but firm. "We can't stay exposed." Kayla nodded, her gaze hardening. I know, we'll make our stand here. They'll come, but we have to be ready. Ben didn't ask what she meant. He knew this was it. There was no more running. They had to fight. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but he could still hold his ground. He would fight to protect them. He would fight until his last breath. The air grew colder, the wind biting into their skin, but Ben didn't care. This was their moment. The Krad Dominion had chased them to the ends of the galaxy, but now they were going to face the consequences of their pursuit. The first of the soldiers appeared on the horizon, their figures silhouetted against the gray sky. Ben's heart raced, his hands steady as he readied himself for what was coming. This was no longer a game of survival. This was the beginning of something much bigger, a battle for freedom, for life, and for the future. And as the first shots were fired, Ben knew that they would either stand or fall together. There would be no retreat, no surrender. This was the moment that would define them all.